Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming in. We're the ProsperWorks webinar of GDPR, ProsperWorks, and you. We'll be covering everything kind of GDPR related today. All right, getting started with a little background on ProsperWorks as a whole. So ProsperWorks is a simple and usable CRM that enables teams to sell more faster. So with ProsperWorks, it allows you to automate tasks, it eliminates manual data entry, streamlines processes, provides analytics, and is built and recommended by G Suite. So it's all focused really around saving users time so you can get out there and sell more. All right, so introducing today's expert, we have Rahul Pathak, who's our VP of Engineering at ProsperWorks. He has our product development and operations. He brings to the table over 20 years of running engineering teams. In his free time, you'll catch him meditating or training for the 100-meter sprint. And then myself, my name is Jake Lindstrom. I'm an account executive here with ProsperWorks, the first account executive on the EMEA sales team. So I help customers evaluate and implement ProsperWorks, and I just moved to London about 3 weeks ago. We're going to start with a little agenda for today's webinar. So we'll be covering 4 key aspects. What is GDPR? What does it take to comply? How is ProsperWorks preparing? And what are your next steps? So let's get started by covering what is GDPR, first of all.
All right. Hello, everyone. This is Rahul here. I run engineering. Thanks, Jake. So today we are going to unpack GDPR. As you know, data privacy is considered a fundamental right in Europe. Until now, several countries have implemented their own laws and enforcement, which is obviously suboptimal. So what GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation, does is it standardizes the regulation and enforcement of data privacy throughout the EU. Specifically, it regulates how organizations can access and process personal data for EU citizens. Now, the key point here is this is not an optional certification, it's the law. So starting May 25th, you must comply, otherwise you cannot do business with EU citizens. There are some serious penalties for non-compliance. GDPR actually has a comprehensive 10 criteria evaluation process, covering things like nature of infringement, what was the original intent, what mitigation steps were taken to reduce impact, and so on. So the fines run up to about 20 million euros or 4% of your global annual revenue, whichever is higher. So GDPR is all about personal data, and let's get an understanding of what we mean by personal data. In GDPR parlance, the person is called a data subject, and personal data is any data that can be used to directly or indirectly identify the person. So as you can see, I put some examples up there. This is not an exhaustive list, but you'll see some examples like name, email, any government-issued public identifier as things you would expect. But in addition, there are other items that are considered personal data, like IP address and cookies, because they can be used to tie back to the individual. Now, in terms of who is affected, it is important to clarify that it doesn't matter where you're physically located as a business, as long as you're doing business with EU citizens, you must comply. As an example, we, ProsperWorks, are a US-based business, but GDPR compliance is essential for us to do business in the EU. And the other point is, it doesn't matter whether you're charging for the service or it's a free service. If you're collecting personal data, you're affected by it.
So then, Rahul, what about those folks in the UK? Obviously, with the current state that's going on, is GDPR going to affect them directly as well?
Good question, Jake. There's 2 use cases to consider there. The first one is a UK-based business is doing business with EU citizens. In that case, the clause of regardless of physical location applies, so you must be GDPR compliant. If you are a UK-based business and you're only doing business with UK citizens, then it's a little unclear, but UK is going to come up with something equivalent to GDPR, so it's a safe bet to be GDPR compliant if you're a UK-based business.
Okay, got it. Good benchmark. All right, so now we're going to cover what does it take to actually comply with GDPR.
So to understand what it takes to comply, we'll need to get familiar with some GDPR specific terminology. So in this section, I will introduce some concepts, and then we'll later tie that all together to understand what it takes to comply. So the first concept I want to introduce is that of a data controller. A data controller is usually the first point of direct interaction with an individual that collects personal data from them. So as an example here, you see a landing page from ProsperWorks.com. This is not our app. This is on our website. And here we showcase a ProsperWorks customer case study and ask for personal information to download that case study. So in this use case, we ProsperWorks are acting as a data controller because we're driving the purpose, conditions, and means of processing personal data. The other example would be you as a customer of ProsperWorks. You are data controllers as you gather information from your own customers. The next concept is that of a data processor. So if you contrast that with a data controller, here, when you choose to use ProsperWorks as a ProsperWorks customer to store customer data in lead and person records in the ProsperWorks application, the ProsperWorks application becomes a data processor because it's acting on your behalf, the behalf of the data controller, to store that personal information. So the people and lead records in your ProsperWorks account turn ProsperWorks into a data processor. So any vendor you use to store customer data could be your email vendor, your marketing automation app vendor, customer success, ticketing apps, customer analytics apps, and so on. They're all data processors that you choose to use to collect and store data as a data controller. Now, if you extend that concept to include all vendors that process data on behalf of a data processor, that's what a subprocessor is. And they include any technology we might use to touch, relay, or store that data. So an example at ProsperWorks is we use Amazon AWS to host our data servers. So AWS becomes a subprocessor for ProsperWorks. Now, it's important to note that the definition of what constitutes a subprocessor is pretty broad. Amazon here, for example, as a hosting provider, isn't really looking into the data that we're storing on their servers, but just the fact that the data is funneled through their servers, resides on their servers, is reason enough for it to be classified as a subprocessor. So the key point is this: to be GDPR compliant, you need to secure your entire data processing chain. As a data controller, as a data processor, as somebody who uses data processors, and as somebody who has subprocessors, that entire chain needs to be secured or GDPR compliant for you to be GDPR compliant. So now GDPR introduces a concept called DPA, and the idea there is, how do you actually make sure that your data processors and subprocessors, all your vendors that touch data, are GDPR compliant? So DPAs are documents. They stand for Data Processing Agreement, sometimes also called amendment or addendum. They all mean the same thing. And the idea there is that the DPA describes an organization's obligation to personal data. So as a data controller, you would sign that with all your data processors and all your subprocessors. We are a data processor for you as a data controller, so you would treat us as any other vendor and sign a DPA with us. Currently, to sign a DPA, you can email us at privacy@prosperworks.com. Very soon, there's going to be an article on our knowledge base which will streamline that process. All right. So now that we've introduced all these terms, data processor, data controller, subprocessor, and DPA, let's put it all together to see what it takes to be GDPR compliant. So the key, as I mentioned, is to take a holistic approach. And what that means is establish clear policies, controls, and procedures for data protection and privacy throughout your organization. You have to get buy-in and align all departments in your company. This cannot be done in isolation by one department or just by IT. It has to be company-wide. Once you do that, then you start getting into GDPR land, where you analyze all areas where you are acting as a data controller. That means you're collecting data on landing pages, on your website, and so on. And see where that data is being stored. Is it secure? Who has access to it? Can it be deleted on request, and so on? There are a bunch of requirements for data controllers. Similarly, you then need to analyze all areas where you're a data processor, and then repeat the exercise for any subprocessors. So the key again, and I'll keep repeating this, is to secure your entire data processing chain. And the way you do this is by making sure that all your vendors that you're using, your subprocessors, your data processors, sign a DPA with you, which legally binds them to be GDPR compliant. You cannot be GDPR compliant if all your data processors and subprocessors are not GDPR compliant. And then finally, you need to implement GDPR specific requirements around concepts like express consent, right to be forgotten, data portability, etc. We'll talk about some of these in the next couple of slides.
All right. So then brings up, how is ProsperWorks preparing to be GDPR compliant?
So on this slide and the next one, I want to give you a quick rundown of some of the things we've done to be GDPR compliant. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but should give you a good sense for what we've done. So the first point, first and foremost, at ProsperWorks, securing your data and ensuring privacy is a top priority for us. We consider it an integral function of our business. To secure your data, we've created a robust set of security policies, procedures, and controls that are adhered to by the entire organization. And then we've made those policies, procedures, and controls auditable by third-party auditors, which allows us to be SOC 2 compliant. If you're not familiar with SOC 2, SOC 2 is a standard that is specifically designed for service providers storing customer data in the cloud. It is designed to give customers confidence that cloud-based providers are treating their data properly and it's safe. And to be compliant, we need to go through an annual external audit that ensure that we have established company-wide security policies and procedures targeting the security, availability, and confidentiality of customer data. If you know ISO 27001, SOC 2 is the American cousin of that standard. They're not identical, but overlap heavily. The next thing we've done is we are EU Privacy Shield certified. Now, the EU Privacy Shield is a framework formalized between the EU and the US Department of Commerce that allows a handshake between companies on both sides of the Atlantic so we can ship data from the EU outside of EU into US and still guarantee that the data is secure. So all our data servers are in the US, and the Privacy Shield certification enables us to store that data on US servers. Next, we've looked deeply into our application and infrastructure security. We run periodic vulnerability and pen tests to ensure that we are secure to begin with, and we are not introducing any new security holes as we add new features for you in the application. Also, we encrypt data both in transit and at rest. So that's a peek into the compliance and technical aspects of security. In addition, we have controls in place to make sure there are very few people in the company that have access to your data, and they have the right training and background to handle that data. So when we hire new employees, two things happen. They go through a criminal background check and data security training. That security training is repeated annually for them. And then the second thing that happens is we evaluate if that employee needs customer data access to do their job. We work on a need-to-know basis on what's called a least privileges model, which translates to very strict controls on who has access to customer data or the infrastructure that stores that data. So the key point here is if it's not critical to an employee's job role to have access to customer data, that access is denied. And finally, we've talked about the proactive side of the equation. On the reactive side, we have a well-developed incident response plan, which would be put into action if there's a security incident, both for evaluating the extent of the damage and communicating it in a timely fashion to our customers. On this slide, I want to talk about some of the GDPR specific requirements that we've addressed. Again, these are just key highlights, not an exhaustive list. The first one is around express consent. GDPR dictates that all consent for collection of personal data should be expressed, not implied. An example of implied consent is by clicking on this button, you agree to the terms and conditions. So you're not opting in explicitly, it's implied. Express consent can be had through a checkbox where the user actually checks in and opts in. This is less for our application because we are a data processor, but more for other areas where we might gather leads, etc. And this is something that you as a data controller will need to do. The same goes for if you're dropping a cookie on an individual, you have to ask for permission. So on ProsperWorks.com, you'll see a express opt-in for cookies. Next, we've aligned all teams at ProsperWorks so that they go through one centralized vendor selection process. This is to make sure that we identify early on any new vendors that are being signed on if they're going to touch personal data. If that's found to be true, then we evaluate them for security and GDPR compliance and sign DPS with them. Because again, we need to make sure that any new vendor that comes into the equation is not weakening our data processing chain and the security around it. And finally, GDPR requires us to disclose the list of data processors we use, and that's available now through one of our customer-facing knowledge base articles. If you just type in GDPR on the knowledge base, you should be able to get to it. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of some of the things ProsperWorks is doing for GDPR compliance and securing customer data in general. We take your data security very seriously, and we're ready for GDPR today.
Awesome. So let's go over what your next steps should be. So first, like Raul mentioned, we really need to approach GDPR holistically. ProsperWorks is just one vendor in the GDPR equation, right? You have to work with all of your vendors to ensure that you'll be GDPR compliant. And then if you have any additional questions or need some support on GDPR, you can request a DPA or just contact us with those questions. You can reach us at privacy@prosperworks.com. Feel free to give us an email. So then in summary, what we learned today, right? GDPR is keeping personal data safe, first and foremost. It's going to affect anyone that's doing business with EU citizens, regardless of where they reside, right? That's key. So no matter where you reside, as long as you're doing business with EU citizens, it's going to affect you. ProsperWorks, we're ready. We have security controls, audits, DPAs, and more in place. So we'll be fully GDPR compliant when those regulations go into effect May 25th. If you need to be GDPR compliant, again, follow the holistic approach. Rahul did a great job overviewing today. And if you get those GDPAs signed, including ProsperWorks. Okay, so now we want to cover a few of the frequently asked questions by some of our users. They've already been sending us quite a bit of questions. So we have a list here that we're going to run through. I'll ask the questions. And so one of the key questions that comes up is using email open tracking, the feature that in ProsperWorks that lets you know the number of times an email has been open and read. Is that GDPR compliant?
Jake, yes, it is, as long as there's express consent from the data subject. So at the point they opt in for collecting personal information, as long as that's listed as one of the things you're doing, it is allowed by law.
And then what is a data protection impact assessment? Does ProsperWorks have one, and do I actually need one?
data protection impact assessment is a risk assessment doc, and what GDPR dictates is that companies that engage in activities that have, quote, high risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons need one of those assessments. And so this generally targets industries like healthcare, insurance, banking, data analytic providers, online marketing companies, search engines, and so on. It does not apply to us. And for our customers, it would depend on what industry they're in. And you know, there are articles online on what exactly the steps are to get a DPIA in place.
Got it. So it sounds like kind of the most key requirement there would be what industry your company's actually within, right?
That is correct.
Okay, got it. Right, so I think you actually mentioned this, but where can I find that list of ProsperWorks subprocessors?
Yeah, so on our knowledge base, if you search for GDPR, you should find an article which has a link to the list of subprocessors. You can also choose to follow that article so that as our subprocessor list evolves over time, you'll get notified.
Oh, perfect. Great. And then one of the last questions is, does GDPR apply to personal data being processed before May 25th effective date?
Yes, it does, because there is no grandfather provision or clause. So if you feel you have collected data without consent, then you know, as a customer, you'll have to go back and handle that.
Okay, awesome. Perfect. Well, I mean, that's all the questions we had here, but you know, if you have any additional questions, please do email us. The best place to email us is, again, privacy@prosperworks.com. Love to receive your questions, and thank you also for joining today. Really appreciate the time.